Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org.
Do you ever feel like you just don't have the time to sit down and read the news every morning? Sometimes things get so hectic you can't even scroll through your feeds while you're trying to get ready. A podcast from Boise State Public Radio has you covered. I'm George Prentice, and I want to invite you to check out The Connector every weekday morning. You can get up to speed on all of the Idaho news you need to start your day without ever interrupting your morning routine. All you have to do is hit play. That's The Connector from Boise State Public Radio. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters. It's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. This is when we get you updated on the news that made headlines this last week. And today, our panel includes Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer, and Kyle Fonenstiel, reporter for the Idaho Capital Sun. And today, we're going to begin our roundtable with some major changes coming to Idaho's Medicaid program, which includes reduced provider payments, new work requirements, and cuts that could leave tens of thousands of people without coverage. In fact, advocates are warning that ripple effects could strain hospitals and raise healthcare costs for everyone. And Kyle, you have been following these developments very closely. So can we just start by me asking you this question? What prompted lawmakers to target Medicaid for such significant reforms this year?
So for a long time, for several years, Republican lawmakers have complained a lot about the program's rising budget and said it needs to be controlled. In 2024, in the legislative session, they finally made a big step toward it with this sweeping Medicaid reform law that cuts costs and makes a lot of policy changes to try to tamp down the program's budget. They've floated some of these policy ideas for years, mainly Medicaid work requirements. This isn't the first time we've been hearing about it, but this bill took a big step in that direction to make some of these policy ideas more concrete and actually happen. In the past, Idaho didn't really have that much success in getting permission from the federal government to do this, because for a lot of this, we need sign-offs from the federal government to make these changes to Medicaid. Last year, lawmakers hoped to be different because the Trump administration was in power, and they were looking for creative ways to change Medicaid to save funds in the program, and it looks like that's what they're getting.
Okay, so Kyle, with that said, in your article, you mentioned longstanding concerns about the growth of Idaho's Medicaid budget. So do we know how big the program is now, and why is it rising?
Yeah, so it depends on how you look at it. So the program's overall budget is at nearly $5 billion. That's huge compared to other state programs, but it's also worth noting that this isn't your typical state program. These are mostly federal funds that are paying for the program. Medicaid is funded by this complicated formula that guides how the federal government splits it. So for Idaho, it's about 70% of total over normal Medicaid costs are paid for by the federal government. So we pitch in 30%. And then for Medicaid expansion, we get a better deal. The federal government pays 90%, Idaho pays 10%. So it's mostly federal funds, but it still is a big chunk of the budget. You know, the state's portion of this is I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's a pretty big chunk of the budget, and it's a very large state program. This program is growing for a few different reasons. First, and this is the big one that state lawmakers point out, is that Medicaid expanded in 2020 after a ballot initiative to serve more low-income earners. So that added about 90,000 people to Medicaid. They're on Medicaid expansion, and the overall Medicaid population is around 350,000 Idahoans. A big reason why Medicaid's budget is growing is because costs of care are rising. That's especially true for the traditional Medicaid population, like kids, pregnant women, and people with disabilities, instead of the
Mhm.
expansion population. I think there's I don't mean to get too complicated, but there's different cost of care for these populations, and it's typically the traditional population that has more expensive care needs and are higher utilizers of Medicaid than people on Medicaid expansion.
So, Kyle, you spoke with Idahoans who rely on Medicaid every single day. What would you say are their biggest fears, biggest concerns right now?
Yeah, the biggest concern that stands out to me is that they're worried they're going to lose their Medicaid.
Hmm.
I think they've been worried about this for a long time. You know, the legislature has uh, over the years debated several bills that might repeal Medicaid expansion. None of those actually succeeded. But this time there's this bill doesn't repeal Medicaid expansion, but it makes a lot of cuts and changes to the programs in ways we haven't really seen before. So you listed a lot of these, but I just wanted to run through again. There's work
Hmm.
requirements for people on Medicaid expansion. There's Medicaid usually checks your eligibility once a year. That's going to go up to twice a year, and there's a lot of concern about how many people might get lost in all the paperwork and who might still be eligible but might lose their insurance. They're going to add copays to Medicaid, and they're going to cut this program for Idaho Medicaid that incentivize doctors to set up 24/7, round the clock care for kids. And eventually, they're hoping to shift to private companies running Medicaid benefits instead of the state. These are all staggered out over a few years, so it'll take some time for us to fully see the impact of this. And these cuts are also coming from a few different sources. So first, we've got that state Medicaid cost cutting law we talked about. Then there's the federal One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which makes a bunch of these changes. There's a lot of overlap between those two laws. So Idaho needed permission from the federal government to do a lot of the things it wanted to do with Medicaid. The federal
Hmm.
Big Beautiful Bill did that. It said you can make these changes. In fact, we're going to make these changes across the states. There's some differences in exactly how they're going to roll out and the timing of some of these policies, but essentially it paved the way for Idaho to make the changes it wanted to make to Medicaid. And then the new cut that the new cut that folks weren't planning on is Idaho's going to cut doctor pay rates for Medicaid. Those cuts
Hmm.
were made a couple months ago to try to prevent the state from hitting a budget shortfall, and those are also playing out in the background to make it harder for providers to break even on Medicaid.
So, Kyle, my understanding is that that provider payment cut will be like 4%. Do we know what kind of impact that's going to have, like on clinics and hospitals? But in particular, I'm thinking of, our rural areas, our rural hospitals, our rural clinics.
Yeah, well, it's important to understand that providers are oftentimes not breaking even when they treat Medicaid patients. Medicaid covers around a fifth of all Americans, but it often pays less than what it actually costs providers to give out services. So any more cuts to that, like these provider pay cuts, are just going to make the losses bigger. Some clinics and hospitals might not be able to weather these cuts, and they might need to stop taking Medicaid altogether or even close.
So I know in your most recent article, Kyle, you quoted advocates who called this, and I'm quoting what they said, a perfect storm. So from your reporting, how dramatic would you say these changes could be for Idaho's entire healthcare system, right? So not just for people who are concerned about losing Medicaid, but even people with private insurance, right?
I was really struck by how so many different advocates I talked to were on the same page about how these cuts are going to impact people. They all painted a really similar picture. I talked to advocates from hospitals, nursing homes, Medicaid patients, and they talked about this ripple effect that these cuts will have on the healthcare system. They said, there's so many cuts on so many different fronts that it's going to strain providers. strain their finances and their ability to stay open, and they might have to make decisions to not accept Medicaid patients, and they might have to shift some of these costs. If they're taking more losses from Medicaid, they don't have a ton of options for how to make themselves whole for that. So a lot of providers these advocates say are going to be raising rates for private insurance. And then
Mm,
hospitals are still required to care for people who don't have insurance. That's a federal law.
mhm.
And if they're caring for more people without insurance, how do they make themselves whole? They might have to raise rates on private insurance. So I guess time will tell how these cuts are actually going to impact these things, but they're touching on so many different parts of the healthcare systems that advocates are on the same page. They say we're all going to feel them.
So, Kyle, do we know how many Idahoans are expected to lose Medicaid coverage under these new federal and state policies?
Yeah, it's a little complicated. So from the federal cuts, some estimates say that about 40,000 people could lose their Medicaid coverage, and the state is also on the hook to lose about $4.3 billion over the next decade from that federal bill. And then if you look at people who are at risk, that grows a little bit more. So there's about another 58,000 Idahoans who could lose their Medicaid expansion coverage because of the work requirements. And the reason that these estimates are a little bit varying is because there's there's people who would definitely not be eligible for Medicaid under the work requirements, and then there's people who would be eligible, but there's some estimate of like how many people might have issues proving to the state that they work and actually going through
Mhm.
that process of validating that they are working for these work requirements. But
So
so the
finally,
impact of the
Kyle.
state's
Oh,
laws
sorry.
are not clear. Oh, sorry.
No, no, that's okay. So as you said, this isn't clear. So my last question for you is this: what should Idahoans then be watching for in the coming months as these cuts move forward? Or, since it's not clear, do we even know?
There's a few things that I'm watching. It isn't clear yet whether the state will need to make more cuts to Medicaid to avoid a budget shortfall. This is a huge state program, and as state budget analysts told the legislature's budget writing committee that there's potentially an even bigger hole than we have right now to make whole. Because if we conform to these federal tax cuts in the one big beautiful bill, and we give agencies everything they're asking for in their budget request for next year, we're looking at an even bigger hole. And so that's something we're going to be watching closely as we get into legislative session and see how all the budget stuff shapes out. And then again, these cuts to Medicaid are staggered out over the next few years. In January, one of the
Hmm.
first cuts is hitting. That's for a Medicaid program that's 24/7 care to kids. That's going to end, and then we've got another year to start seeing more cuts to Medicaid, these more eligibility checks and work requirements, and how they roll out these policies is going to matter a lot. I think people's concerns around this center around how are these policies rolled out, how available are state officials to answer questions about these work requirements, how clear are the forms to prove your work requirements, that sort of stuff, and then again, the legislature is starting the 2026 session in January. So I think a lot more will become clear in the next few months about how these cuts are going to work.
All right. Well, appreciate all of the reporting on this, Kyle. I know how in depth you've gone in this, so appreciate that. Drew, the city of McCall is going to test out a 4-day work week. How and why did this come about?
Yeah, so this is a concept proposed by the city's manager, which is the top executive, who kind of is the top executive for the city, as well as the human resources department. And essentially, the idea behind it is to see if it's a feasible benefit to offer city employees that doesn't necessarily affect the city's bottom line, right? Doesn't affect the budget.
Hmm.
Um, because of course, every employee, we'd love more money, but the city is experiencing the same inflation, the same rising costs as everyone else is, and so that makes it tough to meet those salary demands sometimes. And so the idea is that this could maybe be a different kind of incentive.
Okay, so Drew, per your reporting, other cities have tested this 4-day work week out. So, how has that ended up working out? Because McCall's going to what test this for 6 months?
That's right. It's a 6 month test. It'll start on December 1st, and they'll reevaluate in the spring whether or not they'd like to continue. But across the state, it has been tried in a handful of cities. In fact, the city of Donnelly, where I live, currently operates on a 4-day schedule. Of course, that's a much smaller city than the city of
Hmm.
McCall is, but also the cities of Moscow, Victor, Bellevue, and Driggs have also tried it out, and of those, only Moscow did not continue on. So it largely has been successful when used elsewhere in the state.
So, Drew, how about things? I'm thinking, okay, this is city workers, right? So, you get a lot of snow up in Valley County, in McCall. What about things like snow removal? I mean, how is that going to work in this plan?
Well, and that's a great point you bring up. So it's not the 4-day schedule is not necessarily an across the board thing for all city workers, all city departments. For example, the McCall Police Department, they're not just gonna, not patrol on Fridays anymore. So
Hmm.
there will be some flexible scheduling on account of those department heads. Same thing within Public Works, which is responsible for snow removal, as you mentioned. If we get a big 12-inch dump on a Friday, they're not just going to leave the streets unplowed. There'll be some flexibility built in along those lines. I can tell you, I actually play in the City Hockey League with one of the
Hmm.
city's street operators, and Public Works has been on this 4-day schedule since this summer. They implemented that
Oh.
within their department. And the takeaway from the operator I talked to is that the fundamental change is that you go from 5 8-hour work days to 4 10-hour work days. And this operator I spoke with, he said it actually this summer resulted in quite a bit of an efficiency increase, just from the standpoint of if you think about working on heavy machinery and equipment, you pull out all your
Hmm.
tools, you get into the job, and then at the end of the day, you spend quite a bit of time just putting all that stuff away and getting reorganized. And so to stack those days and make them a little bit longer, they said they got more work done this summer. One of the other interesting aspects of it, as far as the differences between different city departments, the McCall Public Library. At this point, there is no expectation that the library's current operations will change. They'll still be Monday through Friday. Um, but more broadly, I guess to focus on how it does work for those who will be affected, it's mostly city hall and office workers.
Hmm.
Currently they operate on an 8 to 5 schedule Monday through Friday. As of December 1st, that will change to 7:30 to 5:30, and the existing hour-long lunch break will be reduced to 30 minutes. Um, and interestingly enough, if you were to apply this schedule to the entirety of 2026, the result would be about 8 hours more worked for city employees, but with 49 less work days. So that's kind
Oh,
of
okay.
interesting.
Yeah, it is. So, Drew, Valley County is looking into some new rules for snowmobiling. So, what exactly is the county proposing for these snowmobile parking lots? I guess, and why are they doing this now?
That's right. So there's a couple main things to know about the proposed changes. The first one, of course, being increased fees. Day use would be $5 for anybody. If I pulled up with my trailer and sleds, I would pay $5 each time to park in these specific lots, which I guess let's just call those out as well. We're talking about Francie Wallace and Brush Creek and Green Gate. All of those are along Warren Wagon Road. And just to kind of orient exactly where we're talking about, Francie Wallace is the parking area at the end of the winter maintenance on Warren Wagon Road. So if you've ever driven up there in the winter, it's north of Payette Lake, and you get there, and there's a big old barricade that's placed on the roadway, and then it turns into groomed snowmobile route. And so if you park in Francie Wallace, you're right there. You're right on the groom trail up to Bergdorf Hot Springs and Seasash and Warren. Brush Creek is about a mile south of that. Green Gate is even further south on Warren Wagon Road, a little bit closer to McCall. And then there's two other areas that these rules would apply to. A parking area over on Lake Creek Road near McCall, and then the Wellington Snow Park as well, which you've probably seen it near Smith's Ferry there by the Cougar Mountain
Hmm.
Lodge. And so in any case,
Okay,
we're
so
talking about. Go ahead.
oh no, go ahead. No, no, go ahead. Sorry, Drew.
Yeah. So we're the main thing we're talking about here is increased fees. The $5 day use, $10 overnight, and then backcountry residents who buy season-long permits, as well as the outfitting companies. Cheap Thrills, Mountain Meadows Adventures, some of these companies that you can actually rent snowmobiles from and go out for the day. Their seasonal permit fees will double as well from
Mm.
150 currently to 300. So that's one of the main changes. The other one is that these parking areas will actually be divided into different zones based on the type of parking. And the
Mm.
rationale behind that is, in the last couple years, especially as, snowmobiling and outdoor recreation in McCall have just continued to increase in popularity, these parking lots, especially Francie Wallace, have gotten just completely overrun as the winter goes on with abandoned trailers, people parking where they're not supposed to. And the net result of that is, you get these big snowstorms come through, all this snow falls, the county tries to clear the lot, and you can only get so close to an abandoned trailer
Hmm.
to a vehicle that's parked where it shouldn't be. And so the lot just gets smaller and smaller and smaller as the winter goes on, and it gets harder for people to use. And so that's really where this is coming from now.
Okay, so how would these new fees and these parking limits then impact, like, just everyday snowmobilers, or maybe even, as you mentioned, these commercial rental companies and even the back? I mean, there are people that own homes in the back country. So will they be impacted?
Absolutely, and I really like to focus on Francie Wallace and Brush Creek when it comes to this conversation because that's really the pressure point. Um, and so, backcountry, really all three of those groups you mentioned, everyday snowmobilers, the rental companies, and the backcountry homeowners, they stand to be affected by this in a number of ways. One of the changes associated with Francie Wallace is more limited parking for outfitting companies. So in the past, they had two long-term overnight park spots where they could leave their trailers. So that way they're
Hmm.
already on site for the next day, ready to go. And then the other snowmobiles they bring in and they have their day use trailers and they park those. Well, those numbers have been cut. They get one long-term overnight now and two day use, and then all overflow, anything beyond those numbers goes down to Brush Creek. And so the concern there is Brush Creek and Francie Wallace, they're about a mile apart. And they are in fact connected by groomed snowmobile trail. However, the connection is not direct. From it's, if you were to go along Warren Wagon Road from Brush Creek to Francie Wallace, it would maybe take 10 minutes, maybe, to get
Hmm.
from snowmobile from Brush Creek to Francie Wallace. However, via the groomed snowmobile route, it takes you miles around. It would turn that 10 or 15-minute trip into 45 minutes or an hour, which for a
Oh.
lot of people, it just isn't practical. The secondary part of that is that, the county understands this encumbrance and would like to open up an alternative route that's a more direct link, but they're quite limited by geography in that area. If you're familiar, the west side of Warren Wagon Road, it kind of cliffs out up, there's just a steep mountain face, rocky. There's not much to be done there as far as establishing an alternative route. And then the east side, well, it's right along the North Fork Payette River meanders and it kind of drops off. And once again, there's not much room. And so the direct link alternative is really right on the shoulder of the roadway. And there's a
Mm.
portion of that, maybe a couple 100 feet where it would in fact be on the roadway. And depending on the time of year, depending on snow conditions, that might actually mean driving your sleds on asphalt, which is not good. It makes them wear out quicker, higher maintenance cost. Nobody wants that, whether it's your everyday snowmobiler, whether it's your outfitter, whether it's your backcountry residents. And so with the space crunch and Francie Wallace, the concern is, okay, so who's getting dumped down to Brush Creek? And that's still kind of to be decided. There's obviously the overflow for outfitters. There's the belief that some would go down there, backcountry residents, they may be parking down there. Um, but there's a real safety concern associated with that beyond just uh, the maintenance and running them on asphalt. I mean, you're talking about having snowmobiles right alongside, big trucks pulling trailers, things of that
Hmm.
nature. And in fact, the owner of Cheap Thrills Rentals in McCall expressed some concerns that reality could cause some insurance issues and could actually lead their provider to drop them
Oh, wow.
on account of that safety hazard.
So, Drew, what happens next in the process then, and how soon could these changes go into effect if they're approved?
Well, there's a public hearing on Monday before the Board of County Commissioners. They could adopt the new rules as soon as then, and then they would be in place for this season. The good news is there's some optimism that this is, we might have kind of one painful season here of making do and making it work with what we have. However, a 1 acre expansion of the Francie Wallace lot is planned. That should be complete next summer, so in time for the 26-27 snowmobile season. Um, but it looks like for this winter, we're just gonna have to make do.
Okay, thanks for that update, Drew. Caitlin, there are some runoff elections that will be happening next month over in eastern Idaho. Can we start with Idaho Falls? Now, which races are headed to a runoff, and why are the runoffs happening?
Yeah, it's actually pretty interesting because the only runoff elections and recounts are in eastern Idaho this year. So the one in Idaho Falls is we have two in Idaho Falls. So the first runoff election will be for Idaho Falls mayor between Lisa Burtonshaw and Jeff Aldridge. And then the second Idaho Falls runoff will be for Idaho Falls City Council seat two between Brandon Lee and Teresa Dominic. So those ones are they were actually pretty close. For the mayor's race, you have to get above a 50% majority, and Jeff Aldridge obtained about 47%, while Lisa Burtonshaw only obtained about 46%. There was a
Mm,
third candidate, Christian Ashcraft, who got about 6% of the votes and ended up kind of splitting it there. But he won't be listed on the runoff, so it'll just be between those first two. And then for the Idaho Falls City Council seats, um, neither Lee or Dominic reached the majority of 50%. So Brandon Lee obtained about 33% of the votes, while Dominic got about 20% of the votes because there were seven candidates running for that seat. So
oh, okay.
there'll be a lot smaller ballot this time around for the runoffs.
Okay, and then in Pocatello, they're also holding a runoff for mayor. So, who are the two candidates moving forward in this?
Yeah, so Pocatello they only have one runoff race to consider this year. So out of the six candidates that campaigned this year for Pocatello mayor, um, it ended up going between Greg Cates and Mark Dahlquist. Greg Cates secured about 31% of the total votes, and Mark Dahlquist got about 40% of the votes. Again, you have to have over 50% to win the mayor seat. And then that was the only one for Pocatello. So they're doing early voting pretty soon. Early voting will start in Pocatello on November 17th, which I believe is Monday. And then it was originally going to be the 17th in Idaho Falls as well, but they actually moved that to yesterday. So you can actually go early
Oh,
vote in Idaho Falls right now until election day on December 2nd. And early voting will run until the 26th, but you can go vote in person on December 2nd as well.
okay. And so, with that said, if someone wants to vote in person on December 2nd, everything is the same as it would be on a regular election day, correct? I mean, they just go to their regular precinct.
Correct. Yeah. So you'll just go to your regular precinct on December 2nd. And then if you did want to go do early voting, people in Idaho Falls can go to the Bonneville County Elections Office over on North Capitol Avenue. And then in Pocatello, you can go over to the Bandit County Election Office that's on North 6th Avenue. But otherwise, it's just the exact same. You can even, I think there's a deadline for it, but you can even request an absentee ballot up until I believe the 21st, just through your regular elections office.
All right. Well, it's going to be an interesting day come December 2nd in Idaho Falls and Pocatello. So, Brian, you recently wrote an opinion article about how the latest elections show that Idahoans really don't want Christian nationalists gaining more political power. So, let's start here. For folks who maybe haven't followed this closely, can you briefly explain who Doug Wilson is and why Christ Church has become such a big presence in Moscow politics?
Sure thing. So Doug Wilson is the pastor at Christ Church in Moscow and also one of the founders of the Covenant of, or I'm sorry, the Community of Reformed Evangelical Churches, which is a broader evangelical sect that broadly adheres to a Christian nationalist ideology around the country. They've been a prominent presence in Moscow for a number of years. Ever since Doug Wilson's father brought them there, he wrote a book in which he outlined ideas of sort of taking over Moscow on behalf of Christian nationalist interests. But what's remarkable is even though they've been a very strong presence there, buying up major areas in town, they continue to be completely politically ineffective at least by using democratic means. They
Hmm.
recently backed a slate of three candidates, two for the city council and one for mayor. Um, Provided very public support for them as well as financial support, and all three of those candidates did remarkably poorly, despite being better funded in many cases.
Okay, so let's talk about that because, as you said, these candidates were backed by Wilson, and they had quite a rough night at the polls. So, what happened in those races, and why do you think voters rejected them so strongly?
So in city council, it was sort of an eight-way free-for-all race where the top three vote getters would wind up with city council seats. The folks that had been backed by Christchurch wound up placing fifth and sixth, despite being the best funded candidates. And in the mayoral race, again, the Christchurch backed candidate was much better funded, but got only about 30% of the vote compared to 70% for the winner. Um, I think it's pretty clear why voters reject these ideas. The sort of policy positions that this group has taken are radical and remarkably unpopular. Things like the belief that women should not be able to vote. The vote ought to be cast by families, and each family should be headed by a husband or a father who would cast that vote. That's one example. Uh, the notion that certain biblical laws should be enforced by the state, laws against blasphemy. One example Doug Wilson likes to bring up a lot is that it ought to be illegal to build minarets in America, but not to ring church bells. So
Hmm.
that Christianity would have a naturally preferred status. So these are the kinds of ideas that voters consistently reject, including most Christian voters, I think.
Hmm. So you have described Moscow, the Moscow community, as that really understands what Christ Church like long term agenda is. And I bring this up because I think a lot of people really aren't aware of Christ Church. I mean, even in parts of Idaho, let alone nationally, even though they have gotten some national attention recently, having been interviewed by some national networks. So, Brian, what is that agenda, and why do you think it has seemed to turn off voters, in particularly in Moscow, where they are trying to really gain that political power?
Well, it's they're just radical ideas that are sort of out of sync with the history and tradition of Idaho and with people's general values. I think, I haven't seen poll results in Idaho on whether women ought to be able to vote, but I would suspect that virtually all people think they should. I would imagine it's a very small minority view that they should not be allowed to vote.
Hmm.
And that's the explicit position that multiple members of Christ Church have taken, prominent clergy have taken many times. I think that, if you start looking at biblical law and you start think like, really thinking about even Idahoans who are not especially pro-gay rights would probably be against the idea of executing people who are gay for being gay.
Mm-hmm.
That's an example of a biblical law that there has been talk about, within this community about enforcing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I think these ideas are unpopular. That's not to say this group doesn't have any political power. It just
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have very much democratic appeal. It's proven unable to consolidate any kind of power by convincing people to vote the way they want.
So, big picture, what do you think these results say about Moscow's political identity, and maybe even let's broaden it to Idaho's political identity, and whether Christian nationalism is gaining or losing influence here in Idaho? I mean, like as you said, it doesn't mean they don't have political power, but it is the fact that they aren't getting seats in politics.
Yeah. So I think there's, and I didn't delve into this too much into the column, but I think there's an important distinction here, because I do think that Christian nationalism has gained a tremendous amount of political power in Idaho. It just hasn't done it by winning elections.
Mm,
You have the Idaho Family Policy Center is probably one of the more powerful right-wing lobbying groups in Idaho. They've written some of Idaho's anti-abortion laws, some of the laws dealing with transgender folks, many things like this that have passed. They've also proposed a bill that has not passed yet, anyway, to have mandatory Bible readings in public schools. And a number of Christ Church faculty and prominent members are on the board of that organization. So this is a group that has gained political power, but it's done that despite its unpopularity and general opposition from the voters of Idaho, not because it's appealed to them.
all right, thanks for that. Caitlin, have about 2 minutes left and would love to chat a little bit about this new bookstore in Rigby. What exactly inspired three friends to, as you wrote, what Eastern Idaho needs? A spicy bookstore. I mean, how did that all happen?
Yeah, I would say a hole in the business opportunities here in Eastern Idaho for sure.
Yeah.
So uh Bailey, Mia, and Rachel are three friends who actually created a little book club together, and they've been doing that for a few years. And one of them, I believe it was Bailey, saw a TikTok about what she calls spicy bookstores that sell books targeted towards women that are um um that they pertain to like sexually explicit content, a lot of them.
Hmm.
And so they thought, we should do this. We like reading these books. We should offer more of an opportunity. So they are opening up a bookstore in Rigby called Between the Covers, that aims to, in their words, kind of be a place for women to relax and get back to their natures is what they say, and for people to feel comfortable. So they actually are going to be rating each book based on like a spice level. So the lowest spice level is called cinnamon sugar, where it's basically like a high school couple, like, and they become boyfriend girlfriend at the end of the book. And then it
Okay.
goes all the way up to ghost pepper, which is, I would say,
And we can
probably like
imagine.
an SFW, not safe for
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Exactly.
Um, and it's pretty interesting. Actually, we went through the city of Rigby ordinances to see like what an adult bookstore is classified as, and the owners of this store kind of said that it's not really classified as an adult business because all the books you can get there, you can actually also find at like Barnes and Noble. So although some of the content is age restricted, everyone is welcome, and they are planning on opening on the 29th.
And a big thank you to our Reporter Roundtable. Today, our panelists, Caitlin Hart with EastIdahoNews.com, Drew Dodson, reporter and editor for the Valley Lookout, Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer, and Kyle Fonenstiel, reporter for the Idaho Capital Sun. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.